So we have this unrelenting pressure of evil misery everywhere, and the deaths of the people in this world are violent and they're messy and they don't actually mean anything. One of the things which happens, and I'm sure lots of people have read, like the books that Dan Abnett in particular writes, like the Gaunt's Ghost series in its entirety, is an exercise in building up likable characters specifically for the purpose of making sure that they're not around in the next book, right? The whole point of the characters that you like the most is that they are about to die and that they will be replaced by kind of functionally identical characters who will then die, right? It's utterly miserable, and yet these books sell really well and are wildly popular. And there's something going on here which looks really weird. So what's going on that looks weird is, I think, something which, that slide's not going, let's fix this. There we go. Okay, which is to do with how we conceptualize death in virtual worlds in general and in games in particular. And this is something that philosophers talk about a lot. So there are a whole series of arguments about the moral status of game spaces. What are we doing when we play games? What are we doing when we embody virtual worlds of any kind, right? Are the things we do in there what we call morally salient? And if they are, how salient are they? Now, morally salient is not a term that makes any sense, really, unless you are working in this literature. So what it means is when we kill people in game spaces, are we doing something bad, right? And if we're doing something bad, are we doing the same kind of bad as we would if we were killing people in real life, right? So basically, is virtual murder murder, or is it just completely amoral, or is it bad but not as bad as murder, right? And so there's a bunch of stuff in this. Is anyone familiar with the gamer's dilemma? The gamer's dilemma. It's an argument. Okay, real fun argument. I'll give it to you briefly. So the idea is that when we play games, we tend to think that killing people is fine, right? Because it's only a game. But we also think that child pornography is bad because it's child pornography. But if killing people in a game is fine, shouldn't we also think that child pornography in a game is fine? What's different about these two? So the dilemma is, how can we think that murder in a game is fine and that child pornography in a game is bad at the same time, right? Either everything we do in these game spaces is just make-believe, or it all matters, right? And so there's a bunch of work on this for the last 15 years trying to say, well, some of the things we do in game spaces are bad because reasons. And the other things we do in game spaces are fine because different reasons. And we can make it all work together. So what's happening here is that I'm going to run something like this type of argument to try and say, all the death in Warhammer is actually fine because we're doing something kind of different here. Okay. I think in at least most games and in Warhammer generally, the types of things we're doing are not morally salient. That is, we're not actually doing bad things when we enjoy this world or play games in this world, which is kind of good for all of us here, I think. And one of the reasons why the kinds of things we do in these game spaces are not bad in the types of ways that harmful things in reality are bad is that there is no limit on the kind of volume with which characters, units, individuals, people in these contexts can die, right? They're just kind of tokens, and they have what we can call resurrected immortality, so they come back over and over again, right? Everyone has their favorite unit, and that unit dies like 3/4 of the times you play the game, or whatever, but it always comes back. And we can constrain this in certain ways, but it kind of doesn't matter, right? So even if we have a particular avatar, say we're playing a video game version of some of this, we might feel something when our character dies. We might in particular feel something when our character is killed in a multiplayer environment by another person, right? But we shouldn't think that someone is doing a moral harm to us in these kinds of contexts unless they're killing us via some sort of abusive game mechanics, right? So it's perfectly fine in a player versus player game to kill other players, right? It's not fine to hack the source code in some sort of way in order to kill the other players, right? You are doing the moral wrong in the second case, you're not doing the moral wrong in the first case, right? So that's all by way of background. The question is, where does Warhammer fit into this kind of narrative about how death translates from game spaces or virtual worlds into our understandings of morality? And it goes the story something like this. Death is usually this thing which is both uncommon and unbidden, which is to say that in most virtual worlds, you're not dying all the time, right? And you don't really want to. And in the universe of 40K in particular, that's just not true. We expect these huge amounts of death in the game, and we're acclimatized to there being even more death in the wider fiction. Now, I take it that unrelenting misery is not normally the kind of thing that's conducive to long-standing enjoyment, and yet there's, at least in the standard phrasing of Warhammer, unrelenting misery, which people have been enjoying for far too long. I mean, it's been like 3 decades for me, and I'm sure there's at least, I don't know, maybe there's one person in the room who's older than me, but you know, it's been a while. How does this work? So, step 1 is that I think Warhammer makes at least some of the death in the wider game funny. It's enough when you take the concept as a whole to break up the unrelenting stream of death and negativity, just for little kinds of ways, right? Now, when you're playing the game, that's done by the random chance of the dice, right? Yes, that Gretchen can kill your Space Marine chapter master with a single shot, right? When all of the kind of background conditions are met, right? It has 1 wound left and it can fail all its saves, and the Gretchen can, you know, roll a 6 followed by a 6, followed, you know, and then you can roll a 1 followed by 1. It can happen. And if you don't think that's funny when it happens, you are taking the thing too seriously. The whole point of it is funny. When I was thinking it was more about 40K, it was harder to come up with examples of this. When you're talking about Games Workshop in general, you always have Blood Bowl, where it is entirely random bullshit all the way down, right? Everything about that game is chance. It is a terrible competitive game because it's based on a 2d6 system, which is miserable for competitive gaming. But it's a fantastic game to play while you're drinking with your friends because it's consistently hilarious. Okay, 40K wise, when something happens that makes you tilt and want to throw the table, you should laugh at that. That's why it happened. And similarly, if you're thinking not about the game space, but about the universe, orcs and imperial bureaucracy are doing the exact same thing, right? Basically, every time imperial bureaucracy comes up, it is an office sitcom, right? Maybe not The Office, unless you're watching the British version, but it is an office sitcom. Okay. So, Mel Brooks said, tragedy is when I cut my finger, and comedy is when you fall into an open sewer and die, right? I think this has a lot to do with how the comedy works in 40K, right? We don't have the recognizable connections between our society and the society of 40K that you get in other wildly popular science fictional worlds, right? Because they're deliberately abstracted away from a lot of the things that would connect us to the characters in this world, right? It's so ludicrous, so beyond the kind of normal progression from us to them that taking it seriously is missing the point, right? And I'm going to call that separation, right? That's step 1 of how we make this game or this world really exciting, right? Everyone dies in this world all the time for stupid reasons, and that means that the things that matter to us don't matter, right? Race, gender, sexuality, place, whatever. Pick a thing that divides people here. It doesn't there because they're all dead, right? That's step one. But that's still miserable. So then you get step two, which is make that funny. And so you ask why they die. Right? You forgot your sacred oils, and so the door won't open for you because you won't rub the oils on the door in the right way, and some kind of primordial horror of disembowelment, right? Or an orc decides that your head looks like a football, right? Again, funny. Or the Tyranids invaded this planetary system 150 years ago, and the paperwork was filed 140 years ago and was promptly lost. So you get sent to take some supplies to the human planets that haven't existed there for 150 years because they were eaten by Tyranids. But even if you know that, you can't convince the people who are sending you there that you shouldn't go, right? They will happily send you to this world to die because the paperwork wasn't filed, right? This is the oil that makes the Warhammer universe function. It's this absurdity. Okay. So Warhammer is very adaptive to this kind of thing, right? It fills in all of the background noise. People, it goes cyclically through being really serious and then dialing it back to being kind of comedic again, and adapts to the changing norms of societies from where it started with some very British people in the 80s to more modern versions of Warhammer that are like, yeah, women die horribly in this world as well. They die fighting because that's a thing which is normalized now that wasn't normalized in the 1980s Britain, but it's there now, right? And there's all sorts of different scope in this, but because there's always humor there in the background, you can get away from the utterly miserable bits. Okay. So I don't know when we started this. Given
you
the
have like a minute or two, but
yeah.
I mean, the thing is, we've got until half
Yeah.
ask the question, so
because we had that mess. But anyway, I've got a couple of little things more. It's always been there, right? These are quotes from various editions of rulebooks in 40K. You could literally make red painted vehicles go faster in early editions, right? You weren't sure how much faster, and when you tried, you had to go as fast as you were told to by the dice. But if you painted your things red, you could try to make them go faster, and they sometimes will, right? Or you could use this marvelous thing pictured on the slide, which is a shock attack gun, which instantaneously translates a small orcish kind of sub-creature, a snotling, from one place to another, causing it to appear inside the body of its victim, where it will do any of a variety of things depending on what the victim was, right? From kind of explosively disemboweling a foot trooper to like turning up inside a tank and pulling all the levers to make it crash, right? Or, self-destructing the person trying to shoot it, right? This has always been there. And in the lore, and this was spoiled in the opening remarks here, the same thing exists, right? Birmingham, you got told the story, this utterly miserable black planet where everyone dies, because of course the people in Nottingham are going to take the piss out of Birmingham, because that's how England works, right? Or this charming man who is the protagonist of a series of workplace comedies, right? Here's a quote about a corporal who is known as Jinxie because the comedy is not always subtle. In fact, it's hardly ever subtle, but I'm not going to read this out, it's too long. Essentially, all of this really bad looking stuff happens, but it turns out that the bad stuff is always good because in a certain kind of physical comedy, the bad things that are meant to happen to you actually cause good things to happen to you in the long term, right? There are books that aren't like this. Most of the books aren't like this. But that some of these books are like this lets the rest of the world get away with being how it is. Okay? it's not quite plausible deniability because they're not denying how bad the bad things are, but it's an excuse. Anyway, I don't think the humour needs to be everywhere in 40K in order for these humorous elements to kind of protect the law and the universe at large from itself. It just needs to be there kind of as and when you need it. And Games Workshop over the past 40 years has done a really good job of making sure that this kind of humor is there, right? Not always foregrounded, but it's there in a through line throughout the whole thing. And that has, I think, been a really big and often underrated part of the longevity of this world, is that no matter how much they're pushing at any given time, the utter overwhelming misery of it all, there's also a bunch of green people playing football with you, right? Thanks.